Hi everyone, I'm Iselin. I'm from the George Washington University Law School in the United States. And so one disclaimer is that a lot of my research is US based. I do try to learn about and think about and incorporate what I can from other countries around the world. And so to the extent that something I say is that you have additional information about what's going on in your country or region, or what you know actually conflicts with what I'm saying, I'd love to learn that so I can expand my knowledge. Thank you so much for inviting me here and for all the work that the organizers have done to put together this conference. It's just really an honor and a joy to be here. So this presentation, it's really meant as a bit of a provocation. I've given an earlier version of this paper to other sort of non-animal people audiences, some food law people, and just general legal advocates, or legal scholars. And so it's really like a joy to be here talking to animal people, but it still, is maybe some of the ideas will serve as a little bit of a provocation. So I just want to start by sharing some headlines with you from mainstream media in the United States from the last several years. You might be familiar with some of these headlines. We have this cheery one: humanity is about to kill 1 million species in a globe-spanning murder-suicide, from 2019. This one, kind of made me stir a little bit in my seat when I read that, made me kind of feel uncomfortable. There was this cheerful headline about how we only have 11 years left to prevent irreversible damage from climate change. This again was from a few years ago. I think where clock is ticking, we're down to like 8 years left. And this was from last year. Time is running out to avert a harrowing future, climate panel warns. This was a headline about a global sort of scientific consensus from hundreds of scholars from 67 countries or something that were writing about this threat. So why am I sharing these headlines with you, other than revealing my dark habit of doom scrolling, which I do have? It's precisely because of that, right? Because usually, I think a lot of us, we see these headlines in our doom scrolling and they are upsetting and maybe they cause some existential dread, but we're drinking our coffee and having our cardamom bun and we get on with our day. And I think that that's sort of a reality that a lot of us are living in. And maybe those of us in this room were I don't know, maybe a slightly different audience. We think about these ideas maybe a little bit more, disproportionately more than maybe people at large, I don't know. But even I will read these headlines and then go, kind of try to put it out of my mind because it's so upsetting. But when you really stop and think and reflect about what these articles are saying, it's really alarming, right? It's really, really alarming. And when you sort of drill down and read the articles, okay, here's an example of where my formatting got lost, but that's no problem. I highlighted some of this text. We see, the dangers of climate change are mounting so rapidly that they might soon overwhelm the ability of humans and nature to adapt. These academics concluded that, or not academic, scientists concluded that nations are not doing nearly enough. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, he said that this research showed a damning indictment of failed climate leadership across the globe, across governments all over the planet, right? And I think not only do most of us take the time to really drill down and really read every single word of every single article or study that comes out, but we're not even being shown most of these articles and most of these studies. There's a lot of evidence that shows that mainstream media is not showing us articles like this. Only 22 of the top 50 newspapers in the United States covered that UN climate report when it came out. So if you're not reading one of those 22 newspapers, you wouldn't have even seen it. What was happening that week that UN headline came out was we had the birth of the next royal child in the UK a few years ago. Maybe you remember it. And it was, I thought, really shocking to see that, you know, for 7 minutes and 14 seconds, ABC is a major network in the United States media, they were talking about the royal baby, 0 minutes and 0 seconds about the climate report, right? And so we just see that maybe we're doom scrolling. Media is not showing us these stories in a way that is proportional to the dangers and harms that they represent. And you know, I would like to assert that if logic carried the day and we are hearing about, you know, the 6th mass extinction unfolding at the hands of human-fueled habitat destruction and climate change, it's scary stuff, right? And, you know, if ever there was sort of a moment where we have the science, we have the knowledge to say, like, okay, we need to do something about it, like, this is that moment. And we're not acting quickly enough, boldly enough, bravely enough. And if logic carried the day, I would say we would all, you know, go vegan tomorrow or, you know, yesterday. I like this quote: a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. And there's a lot more I could say. I'm not going to because of limited time, but about the current science around climate change and the huge role that the animal agriculture industry plays in perpetuating it. Of course, other things perpetuate it as well. I'm focused today on the animal agriculture industry's role in it. And this quote from a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Stephen Chu: if cattle and dairy cows were a country, they would have more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire EU 28. Just something to think about. So my presentation takes this science as a given, and I'm working from the premise that unless we do something really drastic to stop this march toward irreversible climate disaster that involves our relationship to the beings and the things we consider food, the effects may be unthinkable. The Lancet Commission came out with this report in 2019, and they had this sort of takeaway that I found really powerful that said global efforts are urgently needed to collectively transform diets and food production. What's needed is rapid adoption of numerous changes and unprecedented global collaboration and commitment, nothing less than a great food transformation. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of a great food transformation. How do we get there? Can we get there in our lifetimes? I'm also working from the premise that the animal agriculture industry, it's dangerous not only because of its contribution to the climate crisis. It also represents a global system of unimaginable suffering and cruelty that is socially acceptable. It's legally sanctioned, as Jess said earlier. It's exploiting and oppressing and commodifying billions of individuals every single year. The vast majority of those individuals are non-human animals, of course. Many are also human workers who are disproportionately immigrants and people of color who work in the animal agriculture industry every day, plucking, debeaking, milking, killing, largely for low wages, often for little to no job security, and at great risk to their physical and mental health. So the logical conclusion of this grim reality is that eating animals is an outdated practice that causes more harm than good on almost every conceivable metric. And if ever there was a moment to, where we're saying science really supports this global coordinated effort to change drastically our relationship to food and our food culture, I would say this is it. And if that sounds maybe like a stretch, I think it's interesting that we have in the last 3 years especially the first 2 years of the COVID crisis, we have in the proof of the mass lockdown, social distancing, new norms around remote work, mask wearing. We see that when there's an imminent threat to human well-being, we can sort of make radical behavioral changes. We've seen it happen in the recent past. And yet only about 3% of humans have stopped eating animals. So achieving this kind of widespread paradigm shifting change to our consumption habits won't be easy. And a big part of the problem is that politicians and governments ostensibly should be sort of leading the charge, right? They have a degree of power and influence that most of us ordinary people don't have. They should be leaders in ringing the alarm bell and setting policies and sort of putting us on a course correction. And that's far from the case. They're often doing quite the opposite. There was this probably famous or infamous quote back from the Trump years, one of the White House advisors in 2019, when he was talking about the so-called Green New Deal that some people in Congress wanted to put forth. It has not, been implemented, but he said, you should be aware of this. They want to take away your hamburgers, right? And that I thought was ironic, because nothing in the Green New Deal was talking much about anything about a wide-scale adoption of a vegan diet, much less any laws or policies restricting the consumption of animal-based food. And I'm thinking, given our species' broken relationship to food, maybe we should. But where lawmakers could be allies in developing strategies to combat climate change and promote climate-friendly and cruelty-free food cultures, we just see them time and time again doing the opposite. In the United States, this is a bipartisan affair. We have Democrats and Republicans working hard to promote the meat and dairy industries. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I do sometimes despair, but I've been trying also to not despair and to think about what some strategies might be that advocates for a different food culture, animal advocates and plant food advocates can do in their advocacy that might help us achieve the kind of great food transformation that we need to see in our lifetimes. And so I've written an article about this. I go into great detail about 8 strategies. I'm just going to briefly touch on 3 of those here because of time. So the first is that I think we should be taxing meat and dairy. We have this idea of sin taxes. They've been around for a long time, right? We tax things like alcohol, cigarettes, sugary drinks. Evidence actually shows that people do react to higher prices of taxed products, and they reduce their consumption as a result. And there's interesting research on the benefits of a meat and dairy tax on the environment, animal welfare, and our health. A team of researchers out of Oxford have determined that surcharges of 40% on beef and 20% on milk would actually move the needle and account for a change in consumption that would offset climate change problems caused by eating meat and dairy, and would have a deterrent effect, and it would reduce emissions and have positive impacts on human health. There's no major campaign that I'm aware of to tax meat and dairy, certainly not in the US. Just a few days ago, I read that the head of Danone in the UK has proposed taxing unhealthy food, but did not specifically call out meat and dairy, and certainly wasn't talking about like a 40% kind of tax. But what's interesting is that governmental resistance to a meat tax, it may be misplaced. There's also research out of a UK think tank called Chatham House that indicates that the public would actually tolerate a meat tax because, quote, people expect governments to lead action on issues that are for the global good. And research indicates that any backlash to an unpopular policy would likely be short-lived as long as the rationale was strong. So another strategy would be to remove meat and dairy subsidies. This is a huge thing in the United States food culture. The United States government is reducing the cost of animal-based food in an artificial way that gives them an unfair advantage over plant-based foods having a level playing field. The US federal government spends roughly $38 billion with a B dollars every year to subsidize the meat and dairy industries. They spend 0.04% of that, $17 million, to subsidize fruit and vegetables. No great food transformation can take place in this setting when the government is facilitating artificially low prices for meat and dairy. I think the future of food should be one where animal-based food is all but gone from our diets. If somebody feels they need to eat it, it should be seen as, like truffle oil or saffron. It's something that's very expensive. You eat it in small quantities, maybe for special occasions, if at all. The last strategy I'm going to talk about today is this idea of requiring graphic warning labels, also called GWLs, on food. So governments around the world have long been aware of the power of graphic warning labels, especially in the context of cigarettes. And there's been a lot of research in the context of cigarette graphic warning labels, a lot of interesting litigation on it in the US, who has resisted graphic warning labels on cigarettes for decades. My paper goes a lot into this litigation and all the interesting legal strategies around it. But it's been shown to actually have an impact on people smoking less. And Oxford University professor Joseph Poore, who I mentioned earlier, he's already advocated for mandatory labeling on food to show environmental impact. I like his proposal, but my issue with it is it's what I call emotionally neutral. You can see his labels here. It's red, it's green, it's little circles, it's little, bar charts and graphs. It's been proven in a lot of cognitive science research that we don't really act so well when we're just presented with sort of clinically sterile information. So the 1-2 punch that changes behavior is a combination of scientifically accurate information combined with visually graphic information that you have an emotional appeal towards. When you combine information with an emotional appeal, you have a greater change in behavior. And that's why there's a reason for that graphic in the graphic warning labels, right? People aren't rational when they are thinking about what food they want to eat. And there's, I found this quote super interesting in thinking about that, right? People aren't going to just sort of make the choice themselves. And so I'm thinking that not only should plant-based food and animal-based food be labeled with graphic warning labels to show environmental impact, but those labels should go further. Imagine if they had information at the point of sale about each food's impact also on human health, on animal well-being and exploitation, on the worker conditions involved in producing that item. And in that way, people would be confronted with critical behavior-changing information and culture-shaping information at the point it matters most, when they're in the grocery store aisle deciding what food to put in their cart. So graphic images ahead. These are just examples of graphic warning labels on cigarettes. I'm probably going to go just a couple minutes over time, just to warn you, but I'm going to zoom ahead. So I have other strategies that I'm not going to talk about now that I wrote about in my paper. What I want to spend the rest of my time talking about briefly is what I think is this more provocative question, which is, okay, we have these strategies, maybe they could move the needle and sort of level the playing field so plant-based food can compete with animal-based food. But what should this sort of vegan utopia that I have in my mind look like, right? Like, should the great food transformation be fake meat free? And it's a question I've been asking myself a lot, because we've been seeing a lot in the media about what I'm calling cheekily fake meat, and I know a lot of vegan advocates would bristle at me using that term, and I'm using it intentionally. A lot of my writing is about language and the words milk and meat and what do they mean and what cultural space they occupy. So I'm talking now about cultivated meat, and that's made in a laboratory and it's genetically identical to animal flesh. But the argument is that it's cruelty-free. And a lot of people have sort of pinned their hopes on the future on cultivated meat. And we have $2.3 billion of venture capitalist money being poured into this industry. And it's a ton of money is going into trying to make cultured meat succeed. And right now, there's been some regulatory successes in the United States. Cultured meat is sold in one country in the world, Singapore, and everywhere else it's sort of being contested. And because of all this hype, we see the animal agriculture industry feeling threatened. There's a lot of litigation in the United States about cultivated meat, contesting the word meat, deciding whether or not we should, sell these products, what to call them. There's these real meat acts in dozens of states that I've explored the litigation around, what's real meat and what should be allowed to be called meat. We see Italy proposing a ban on lab-grown food to protect its dietary traditions. So there's a lot of sort of threat happening at the governmental level. And I'm pretty much just wondering whether or not, we have this sort of rise in the interest of cultivated meat, billions of dollars being poured into it. Should it be the future of food? And I'm not so sure that it should be. Recently, earlier this year, a legal scholar you might be familiar with, Iselin Gambert, forgive me if I'm saying your name if you're watching this on YouTube later, but he wrote a really fascinating chapter called The Empty Promises of Cultured Meat, where he really broke down he's somebody that worked at the Good Food Institute and worked on the regulatory space around cultivated meat. He knows this space very well, and he's like, these $2.3 billion could be used in a lot of other ways in vegan advocacy. Are we able to see this cultivated meat sort of coming to scale quickly enough to have the sort of culture paradigm shifting impact we need it to have? Right now, cultivated meat is available in one country on one day of the week with reservations only, like on a Thursday in Singapore if you get reservations. And, the thought experiment is, can this really be brought to scale, like fast enough for it to make a difference? And is it worth the billions of dollars we're pouring into it that could be used in other kinds of like vegan advocacy? So my final point is that I agree with Iselin, and I'm also really wary of cultivated meat for these other reasons, which I think that maybe cultivated meat, it's a good way to assimilate vegan food or cruelty-free food, I guess I'll call it, into current dominant food culture, but they're not a silver bullet to fixing our broken food system. And I think that these products may paradoxically thwart our efforts to transform our species' relationship to food because they perpetuate cultural norms that glorify flesh eating and undervalue plant eating, and that have been around for centuries. We've seen, I've written in other papers about how meat eating is entwined in many cultures' sort of national identity, and that meat is a symbol used to perpetuate racist and sexist tropes, tethered to outdated gender norms and masculinity ideals in dominant food culture. We have this quote, it's from the 1800s, this like racist and sexist trope, but quotes like this made by scientists back then have sort of formed a foundation that we still see as a narrative thread in our food culture today that's perpetuated by sort of racist and sexist rhetoric. And we see like language like this. I think you can see a direct thread to a headline like this, right? Eat like a man with the big steak. And then of course, Carol Adams' landmark work talking about the problems between the meat industry and the relationship between sort of the ways in which both women and non-human animals are exploited and oppressed in our sort of dominant food culture. And I don't know that we really break free of these problematic rhetorics if we spend our billions of dollars and pin our hopes on cultivated flesh eating. And so to close, I think I'll just say one more thing is that even cultivated meat perpetuates these sort of gender-based problems. Right now, you can't have cultivated meat without killing pregnant calves and taking blood from the heart of the fetus of the calf to get the fetal bovine serum that's used as the growth medium for the cultivated meat. And so you have another example of how even cultivated meat is reliant on exploiting and oppressing biologically female animals and their children in ways that we also see in the dominant meat industry. And so, I think where I come down on all of this is that marketing cruelty-free meat to exist rhetorically within traditional norms of our food culture, it might succeed in getting some people to eat incrementally more cruelty-free food, but I don't think it's enough, right? I don't think it's enough to bring about this rapid and fundamental paradigm shift that we need to create this great food transformation. I think that for that to be successful, we need to question our animal eating habits and our flesh eating habits. And we need to deeply reflect not only on the ways in which animal eating is harmful to the animals we're eating, but also on the environment and to our health, but also the ways in which it may be keeping us stuck in outdated ways of interacting with each other and our fellow earthlings. And incrementally replacing animal-derived meat with cultivated meat, it's appealing in part because it doesn't really require us to collectively throw out everything we think about food and start from scratch, right? It feels kind of safe. And I'm thinking that this moment calls for something bigger and bolder and braver and more disruptive. And I think maybe the path forward is actually for us to intentionally as a species consciously choose to collectively take away our own hamburgers, right? And pursue a food culture that bears little resemblance from the one that is harmful and exploitive and that we've been inhabiting for centuries and we still inhabit today. So thank you so much.